My new director looked straight at me across the conference table, coffee still steaming in his hand like he had all the time in the world, and said, "Look, Daniel, I'll be honest with you. The people who built this department did good work for their time, but we're restructuring around agility. If you can't see yourself fitting into that vision, I want you to feel free to explore other opportunities." He said it the way you tell someone the restaurant is closing, polite, final, like the decision had already been made before I walked in. I nodded once, closed my portfolio, and said, "I appreciate the transparency." He smiled. He thought that was agreement. It wasn't. Let me back up about 14 months, because none of what happened in that conference room makes sense without understanding how I got there, what I had already done, and exactly why my director had just made the most expensive mistake of his career. I had been with the company for 11 years when my director arrived. Not 11 years of coasting, 11 years of building something. I came up through the data infrastructure side of pharmaceutical operations, which means I spent the better part of a decade learning a language most people in the industry can barely pronounce. Clinical trial data pipelines, regulatory submission frameworks, FDA audit trails. The kind of work that nobody talks about at conferences, but that, if it breaks at the wrong moment, will take a $2 billion drug approval down with it. When I joined, the department was 4 people sharing 2 monitors and a prayer. By the time my director walked in with his Stanford MBA and his 37-page transformation roadmap, we were 18 people running validation infrastructure for 9 active Phase 3 trials. I had built most of that. Not single-handedly, I want to be fair, but the architecture was mine. The methodology was mine. And one specific piece of it, a regulatory data reconciliation framework I had developed entirely outside of work hours, on my own equipment, using no company resources of any kind, was mine in a way that went beyond just professional pride. I want to be precise about this point because it matters enormously to what came later. I had started building that framework 3 years before I ever joined this company. I was between jobs, living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio, and I had a theory about how pharmaceutical companies were losing weeks of timeline during FDA submission prep because their data reconciliation processes were fragmented and manual. I spent 8 months, evenings, weekends, a miserable February when I barely left my apartment writing a modular software framework that could automate the most painful parts of that process. When I finally landed this job, I brought the framework with me as a personal tool, the same way a carpenter brings his own chisels. I had also, because I had seen enough of the industry to know how these things go, filed a provisional patent application on the framework before I ever signed my employment contract. 18 months after that, I filed the full non-provisional application. The patent was issued 14 months before my director sat down across from me with his restructuring vision. I am telling you this not to brag, but because what my director did not know, what he had never thought to find out, was that the efficiency gains he had been presenting to the executive team as evidence of his own transformation success were almost entirely attributable to my framework. His 37-page roadmap had slotted neatly on top of infrastructure I had already built. He had inherited a runway and convinced himself he had constructed the airport, but I am getting ahead of myself. My director's name was Preston. He came from a consulting background, which, in my experience, means he was very good at describing the shape of a solution and considerably less experienced with the texture of actually building one. He was not a bad person. I want to be clear about that too. He was ambitious, and he was in over his head, and those 2 things combined made him genuinely dangerous to the people around him. His first 6 months were mostly harmless. He reorganized reporting structures, rebranded our team as the Data Operations Center of Excellence, and installed a project management platform that we had to spend 3 weeks migrating all our existing documentation into. The work continued. I adapted. His second 6 months were where the pattern became visible. Preston had decided, and I believe he genuinely convinced himself this was forward thinking, that the department needed to be rebuilt around younger talent. His phrase for this was bringing in fresh perspective. What it meant in practice was that anyone over 45 who had not aligned themselves closely to his vision was being quietly sidelined. Responsibilities reallocated. Meeting invitations stopped appearing. Projects that had been yours were handed to someone new without announcement or explanation. I watched it happen to my colleague first, a woman who had been running clinical data quality for 7 years, and who was, without exaggeration, one of the 3 best people in our field I had ever worked with. One quarter, she was leading a major validation project. The next quarter, she was being asked to document legacy processes. The quarter after that, she was gone, with a severance package and a LinkedIn post about exciting new opportunities. I watched. I made note, and I began to prepare. I am not a dramatic person by nature. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, the kind of place that teaches you early that the people who survive difficult situations are the ones who stay quiet, stay useful, and know exactly where the exits are before they need them. My father was an electrician for 30 years. He used to say that the most important work you do on any job is the work nobody sees, the work in the walls, before the drywall goes up, that either holds or fails when everything depends on it. I spent the next 6 months doing work in the walls. I documented everything, every instance where my framework had been used in a regulatory submission, every executive presentation where its outputs had been cited as efficiency metrics, every email chain where Preston or his team had referenced the capabilities of our infrastructure without understanding or acknowledging the underlying system that made those capabilities possible. I was not building a legal case, not yet, but I was building a record, and I was building it methodically, the way I built everything. I also had a conversation with an intellectual property attorney. Just exploratory. I walked him through the patent, walked him through my employment contract, walked him through the company's IP policies, and asked him to tell me, plainly, where I stood. He told me, plainly, that I stood on solid ground. The framework predated my employment, was developed entirely with personal resources, and was covered by a valid patent. The company had no claim to it. What they did have, because I had been using it as part of my work without a formal licensing agreement, was an argument that they had an implied license to use it, but implied licenses are limited in scope, they do not convey ownership, and they can be structured or terminated. He said it the way you tell someone the weather is going to change. Informative, useful, like the situation was already clear and just needed to be named. I thanked him, paid his invoice, and went back to work. The conversation with Preston came on a Tuesday in March. He had asked for a one-on-one, which was unusual. He had mostly stopped, including me in anything that required a direct conversation. I knew what it was before I walked into the room. I sat down, put my portfolio on the table, and waited. He talked for about 6 minutes. He covered the restructuring. He covered the new strategic direction. He talked about the team needing people who were, and this was the phrase he used, builders of the new, not stewards of the old. He was not unkind about it. He was thorough. He had clearly practiced, and then he said it. If you can't see yourself fitting into that vision, I want you to feel free to explore other opportunities. I nodded once, said I appreciated the transparency, watched him relax. Then I asked one question. I asked it calmly, with the same tone I used when I was walking a junior analyst through a data validation process. Not confrontational, not loaded, just precise. I said, just so I understand the transition plan clearly, when you move to the new infrastructure framework, what's the technical path for replacing the current reconciliation system? Preston paused. Not long, maybe 2 seconds. But I had been watching him long enough to know the difference between a thinking pause and a gap pause. This was a gap pause. He did not know what I was referring to specifically. He knew there was a reconciliation system. He did not know what it ran on. He said, "We'll work through that in the transition planning process." I said, "Of course. I'll make sure my documentation is thorough." He nodded. I left. What happened over the next 3 weeks was not something I engineered. I want to be honest about that. I had positioned myself correctly. I had built the foundation carefully, but the specific sequence of events that followed was, to a significant degree, my director's own doing. The first thing that happened was that Preston's team, in the process of beginning the infrastructure modernization, discovered that the reconciliation framework was not a standard commercial system. It was not off-the-shelf software. It was not a licensed product with a vendor they could call. It was a proprietary system, documented in my name, referenced throughout years of regulatory submissions, and now as of my quiet conversation with the IP attorney 2 months earlier, operating under a formal, limited, time-bound license agreement between myself and the company that I had had my attorney draft and deliver to the legal department on the same day Preston told me to explore other opportunities. I had submitted that paperwork on the drive home from the office, not out of anger, out of precision. I had prepared the draft 3 months earlier. I had simply been waiting for the right moment to file it. The legal department, to their credit, escalated immediately. I heard about the meeting secondhand, from someone who had been in the room and who called me that evening with a tone in his voice like he had just watched a car accident happen in slow motion. Preston had been informed by the company's general counsel that the data reconciliation framework underpinning the last 4 regulatory submissions, the one they had been planning to simply carry forward into the new, Infrastructure was covered by an active patent held personally by the employee he had just invited to find other opportunities. The implied license the company had been operating under had been replaced, as of 2 weeks prior, by a formal agreement that defined the scope of use, the term, and the conditions under which it could be terminated or renegotiated. The conditions were straightforward. The license was tied to my employment. It transferred no ownership. It could not be sublicensed to a new vendor or system without my written consent. And it contained a clause, which my attorney had suggested and which I had agreed to immediately, specifying that any material change to my employment status, including termination, demotion, or constructive dismissal, would trigger a mandatory renegotiation period of no less than 90 days, during which usage of the framework would require a separately negotiated interim agreement. The company had 2 active IND applications in preparation. Both were using the framework. One of them had an FDA submission window in 11 weeks. The room got very quiet, I was told. I want to pause here because I know what some people are thinking. They are thinking this sounds too clean, too perfectly arranged. And I will tell you honestly that it was not as clean as it sounds in the telling. There were 3 months in there where I genuinely did not know if I was going to come out of this in one piece professionally. There were evenings where I sat at my kitchen table with the patent documents and the employment contract and the correspondence spread out in front of me, and I thought about what it would mean if I was wrong, if the attorney had missed something, if the implied license argument was stronger than he thought, if the company decided to fight it regardless of the merits. I have a mortgage. I have a daughter in her first year of college. I was not operating from a position of invulnerability. I was operating from a position of careful preparation, which is not the same thing. And it is important to understand the difference. But the preparation had been real, and the position held. The call came from the company's general counsel on a Thursday afternoon. Not from Preston, not from HR. From the general counsel directly, which told me everything I needed to know about the internal temperature of the situation. She was professional. She was precise. She explained that the company wanted to ensure a smooth transition, and that they believed there was an arrangement that would serve everyone's interests. She asked if I would be open to a conversation. I said I would be open to a conversation. I called my attorney immediately afterward, and he joined the call 2 days later. What I can tell you, without going into the specifics that are covered by the settlement agreement I eventually signed, is that the outcome was not what my director had envisioned when he talked about restructuring around agility. I remained employed through the completion of both IND applications, at a compensation level that reflected, for the first time in 11 years, the actual value of what I had built. A formal, separately negotiated licensing agreement was executed, covering the company's continued use of the framework. And the restructuring that had been designed to quietly remove me from the department was replaced by a transition plan that I was instrumental in designing. Preston was gone 4 months later. His departure was announced as a mutual decision to pursue new opportunities, which is the corporate equivalent of the restaurant closing. I was not involved in that outcome, and I will not pretend otherwise. That was between him and the executive team, and I suspect the 2 IND delays his restructuring had contributed to were a more significant factor than anything I had done. I kept my same desk. I kept my same parking spot. I ate lunch in the same break room I had eaten lunch in for 11 years. The thing I think about, when I think about all of it now, is something my father said to me a long time ago, when I was maybe 16 and furious about something I do not even remember what, and feeling like the unfairness of the situation was unbearable, like the only right response was to make the unfairness loud. He was replacing a breaker panel at the time. He did not look up from what he was doing. He said, "The work in the walls is what lasts. Everything else is just paint." I spent 11 years doing work in the walls. I documented it, I protected it. I did not rush to the confrontation, and I did not let the insult pull me off the foundation I had already built. When the moment came, I did not have to raise my voice. I did not have to threaten anyone. I did not have to do anything dramatic at all. I just had to have done the work. Some of my colleagues have asked me since then what the first sign was, the moment I knew something was being built against me and that I needed to start preparing. I tell them the honest answer, which is that there was no single moment. It was a pattern. It was the way a room changed temperature when certain people walked in. It was the reallocation of my colleagues' responsibilities without explanation. It was the phrase builders of the new, not stewards of the old, which anyone who has been in a corporation for more than 5 years knows is not a compliment. The sign was not dramatic, it was quiet. And the response could not afford to be dramatic either. I want to be honest about one more thing before I close, because I think it is the part of the story that people find least satisfying, and I think it is actually the most important part. I was lucky. Not in the sense that anything good happened to me by accident. I had built every piece of what protected me deliberately, over years, with intention. But I was lucky in the sense that I had the knowledge, the resources, and the time to do that building. I had an attorney I could afford to consult. I had a patent that was already filed. I had 11 years of documented contributions that were genuinely difficult to argue with. A lot of people who find themselves in the position I was in do not have those things. They have just as much skill and just as much integrity, and they work just as hard. And when the moment comes, they have no walls to point to, because no one ever told them the walls were what mattered. So if there is anything I would want someone watching this to take away, it is not the outcome of my specific situation. It is the practice that made the outcome possible. Protect your work. Document what you build. Understand what your employment contract actually says about intellectual property, not what you assume it says, but what it actually says. In writing, ideally with a professional who can explain the parts you are not sure about. Know the difference between what belongs to you and what belongs to the company, and make that distinction formal before you ever need it to matter. The contingency plan is not something you build when the crisis arrives. It is something you build on a quiet Tuesday evening, 3 years before anyone ever sits across a conference table from you and talks about agility. The most useful conversation my attorney and I ever had was not the one where we discussed strategy after Preston's meeting. It was the one I had with him on a Wednesday afternoon, when everything was fine and I simply wanted to understand where I stood. That conversation cost me $400 and about 3 hours of my time. It was the best investment I ever made. My daughter called me the night the settlement was finalized. She did not know the details. I had not told her much, because I did not want her to worry, but she could tell from my voice that something had resolved. She asked if everything was okay. I told her everything was fine. I told her I was good. I told her I would explain the whole story sometime when we had a few hours and a decent meal in front of us. She said, "Dad, you sound like you've been carrying something heavy for a long time." I thought about that for a moment. I thought about the 3 months of evenings at the kitchen table. I thought about the Tuesday Preston told me to find other opportunities. I thought about the Wednesday I had decided, quietly, that I had already found one right where I was. I said, I was, but I put it down. She laughed a little. She said, "Good. It was good. It still is. I go to work in the same building, eat lunch in the same break room, and do the same work I have always done, which is to say, the work that holds everything else up. The work nobody talks about at conferences. The work in the walls. I documented it. I protected it. I let it speak for itself when the moment came. And the moment passed.